Hey folks, thanks for coming out. In this video, I'd like to introduce a little bit of the course, Principles of Global Studies. And to do this, I'd like to first start talking a bit about where the idea of globalization comes from. Secondly, talk a little bit about what is global studies. I know it's a little bit of an odd field, doesn't really sound like a lot of other majors in college, so what is this all about? What do people do about jobs and careers? Where does this lead them? And three, last but not least, what are the goals of this course? How is it going to be structured? So with that kind of laid out, let's begin from there. So globalization is not an easy word to define. I've given you a kind of working definition from the Oxford English Dictionary at the top of the screen. The action, process, or fact of making global, the process by which business or other organizations develop international influence. It's good, but it's very general, and it's not really the most useful thing for us. People make statements about globalization which tend to be a little bit ahistorical, as I'll illustrate with these two quotations, and also very, very broad and sweeping. Thomas Friedman, writing in the early 2000s, globalization involves the inexorable integration of markets, nation states, and technologies to a degree never witnessed before. In some ways, of course, sounding exactly like Karl Marx, somebody with whom he has very little to do ideologically. Karl Marx, who said in the 1840s and 1850s, all old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, etc., etc. And so we get these very sweeping, very almost dramatic and operatic ideas of what globalization is all about. And they're kind of cool and fascinating, but they're not really very helpful for us. So what may be a little bit more helpful is to generate some specific ideas about what globalization is and what studying it means for us today. Well, whoa, my apologies. Well, we're not the first ones. We on Earth in the 21st century are not the first ones in the world to have thought of the globe and our place in the globe as a whole. This has been going on at least over the last several thousand years, and has been resurrected and brought to people's attentions in all kinds of interesting and complex ways over the years. The image on the top left is Ortelius's Theater of the World, the Orb of the World, which was which was intended to function as a bit of a memory theater. The idea being that all of the human dramas in the world could be literally mapped out. And we, as people seeing this, could step aside and look at it and appreciate it in its totality. Ortelius referred to this very often as a world machine, a world that basically where we can appreciate how it works and how it functions very much in this way by stepping away from it. This idea of looking at the world as a whole, of globalization as a kind of consciousness, comes back multiple times over the years. So 1972 Apollo 17 photograph of the whole Earth from space sets off a number of considerations about environmentalism, about care for the Earth, as a result of being able to see a picture of the whole thing taken together. At other times, of course, representations of the globe and of global consciousness have focused rather differently and have been framed rather differently. Couple of examples I have for you here. The top one being one of Charles Owen's many maps of World War II, published in the Los Angeles Times, where the representation of the globe as a theater of war and of the Pacific as a part of the globe where the war was going on really captured people's imaginations. The bottom one is a projection of the globe's surface from Jacques Bertin, the French cartographer, which actually does something really interesting because, as you may know, if you have a regular map of the world's surface, it compresses and it distorts the shape of countries and the shapes of continents. Well, Bertin's projection, by basically turning it into this globe-shaped projection of the world, really minimizes distortion, and was then used in multiple descriptions, multiple textbooks on geopolitics, on rivalries between different countries to give a more global perspective on these very same issues. So this is a little bit about how I see globalization. It's a set of ideas, it's a set of sensibilities about how people see the world around them and how the world is kind of the framework for human activity on Earth. As students of the world, the way in which the globe is represented and the way in which the world around us is represented then become really, really important. As a field of study, since about 1972 or so, there has been a sea change in how people experience the world around them, how they make a living, identify politically, etc., etc. This is the argument I make for this class, and this is the argument I make for studying globalization today. There's been this massive transformation over the last 50 years. But this change is not entirely new. Parts of it happened earlier in waves of globalization from the 17th and 19th centuries, and even one could say from the 16th century, like we were just looking at Ortelius's map. Others are more recent, but their long-term importance is up for dispute. For many people, globalization means crossing from one country into another. Here in SGS, we tend to think of that as internationalization. For us, globalization means something bigger and something else, that there are phenomena that are different and not just bigger when they're at a global scale. The idea then being that, let's say, something like global environmentalism is not simply the environment of 196 separate countries. There is something different about thinking about environmentalism at a global scale. The issues are different, the way we understand them is different. That is not simply the sum of the countries on Earth. It follows then that students of global studies see politics, economics, and culture as well global phenomena. We are students of the world. And being students of the world means that in a way you see problems and you start to see issues a little bit differently. Global studies really builds on a number of transformations in the human sciences, sociology, anthropology, geography, etc., in order to construct a series of global issues and global problems and debates that we then study and try to understand more deeply. As a major or as a minor, we do all kinds of things to help our students take this background in globalization and apply it concretely to multiple career fields. Some of our students go on to law school, some of our students go on to medical school and have these more, let's say, classic career paths, and that's great. And lots of other folks want to work, for example, in public policy, in the humanitarian sector, in global environmental law for international organizations. And so they build up their skills through the Malikian Center, through the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and through our career and professional preparation classes, in order to basically bring together, on the one hand, this kind of cultural, political, economic background, and on the other hand, the practical skills in stats and R and all kinds of software packages they're going to need to have really successful and fascinating careers. This is what global studies is, and this is what global studies offers us as students of the world today. So, to understand globalization and how we're going to study it in this class, we can divide it into three processes. State-level processes focus on the state or the country as the driver or the source of resistance to globalization and global change. We're going to spend a certain amount of time on that. Economy-led processes focus on economic development and underdevelopment, cultural imperialism, global inequality, etc. One of the arguments I'm going to make in this class is that the economy-led arguments about globalization can't really function without states and without taking into account how states behave under conditions of globalization. And that states themselves, while they might imagine themselves to be sovereign and powerful and all this kind of stuff, can't really function without cultural institutions. And what I mean here by cultural institutions are non-governmental organizations, all kinds of campaigns and efforts to create new norms. in areas like human rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, the diffusion of democracy. All of these I define as cultural processes. They're not really part of the market. They're not really things that states always want. In fact, in some cases, states actively try to resist them. So I identify them as cultural insofar as they are trying to drive new norms and new ideas of what ought to be in the world, and in so doing, shape the kind of globalization that states and economic institutions then have to deal with. We're going to come back to these three processes of globalization a lot over the course of this semester. I want to give you a bit of a heads up and explain sort of the way this course is going to work structurally. In terms of our learning objectives, by the end of this course, I want you to be really, really versant in our three approaches to globalization and global change. I want you to be able to correctly talk about the changing role of the state sovereignty under conditions of globalization. We have a chapter on this to really break this down in some detail. I want you to be able to pinpoint the 19th century and the emergence of marketplace society, and trace how this shift in thinking has helped drive parts of the globalization process. We have, again, a bunch of readings on this phenomenon, on the invention of marketplace society, and how it's so dramatically altered the way we think about globalization today. I want you to know a few key facts about the World Bank, Global Division of Labor, NGO, INGO campaigns. So I want you to know, for example, about the Tropical Timber Campaign that we're going to get to much later in the class. And we will have quiz questions, of course, not quite this simple, but, along the lines of, okay, what is the World Bank? Or what is the IMF? Or, is the World Bank a bank? I mean, they won't quite be this simple, but you get the idea. They'll basically be to make sure you can correctly identify and talk about the basic functions of some of these institutions. We will consider the idea of global culture or instrumental rationality, driven by human rights and environmental NGOs, as an important component of globalization. I said this in the syllabus, I'll say it again over here. I think one of the big arguments for this course, or in this course rather, is the idea that we actually have a global culture or a shared form of instrumental rationality. It's an idea we're going to come back to a lot. And last but definitely not least, you're going to write a paper at the end of this course focusing right now. The options I have in hand are on economic development or on human rights. I may expand that slightly as we go through the semester, but this is what I'm thinking of and working on now for your end of semester projects. And lastly, in terms of the organization of the class. Modules are organized weekly. Everything you need is either found in your course reader or in the module itself. Work tends to fall on the Thursday, Sunday, or Thursday, Monday cycle. Dates will be clearly posted in Canvas, so it'll be obvious when you have to get your work done by. Expect 1 to 2 lectures a week, and sometimes some notes detailing key ideas. Sometimes it's easier to write out and describe an idea than to do a lecture on it, and so that's what I'll do. Definitely look for overlaps between the lectures and the notes and the materials that come up in your readings. Easy example. We're going to have relatively soon a reading on world systems theory. We're going to have a lecture on world systems theory. You can pretty much bet you're going to have some quiz questions on world systems theory. So when you see these overlaps, definitely make a note of that, because you know that I'm going to be asking you questions on that. Last but not least, never hesitate to get in touch, whether you have questions about this course or questions about global studies or study abroad or internships, or you want to talk about going to grad school one day or something along these lines. As long as it's basically related to what you're doing at ASU, what we're doing in global studies, I'm happy to talk. I'm happy to find out more about what's going on and what you're interested in doing. Thanks very much, folks, and I look forward to working with you all this semester.